Dr. Peter Freewater. I work for the Hawkesbury and Nepean Catchment Management Authority, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about salt marsh. So what is a salt marsh? Basically it's a plant community that's found in estuarine environments. It tends to be found high in the intertidal zone, so that would be about 1.8 metres above what they call Australian height datum, which is very similar to mean sea level, if you like. And it's an area that only gets inundated by the tides generally once or twice a month, and it's during a large spring tide. So a spring tide isn't in spring, they call it a spring tide. I don't know why, maybe because it springs up, but it's when the moon is generally either full or a new moon, and it's aligned with the sun and the earth to create a larger tide. And it's when this large tide comes up that it inundates the salt marsh. And it's because it's so salty in the salt marsh that salt marshes are one of those areas that generally tend to be free of weeds. Now there's a variety of different animals that live in the salt marsh and have adapted to that occasional inundation. For example, it's full of insects, and when you look at these rushes, there's lots of spiders, you get all sorts of little beetles and bugs living in among the larger plants. On the ground and in the ground you get polychaete worms, that's worms with legs, and you get little crabs, and you get various snails, mostly little snails or gastropods. So during these large spring tides, the crab release their zoe, as they're called, and so do polychaetes and the mollusks, and they release them in the tens of thousands, and out they go, and then it becomes a feeding frenzy for all of these smaller fishes and some of the larger fishes. Now the little glassfish are one of the most abundant, if not the most abundant, little fish in the estuary, and they're pretty much the things that the larger fish eat. So without the crab zoe and the larvae from the other invertebrates, these fish might not get a proper feed, and then they may perish, and then the whole fishery may collapse. So they're important for that reason. Now they're also important for some of our rare and endangered birds and bats as well. We get a lot of migratory birds that use salt marshes, and we have to look after certain areas because they're part of our international agreements. Microbats eat the mosquito larvae, so they're very rare, and you get this, and they're very cute too. These tiny little microbats that come swooping down at night time, eating those mosquitoes. So when you think that mosquitoes don't actually do anything or contribute apart from giving you a nasty bite and spreading malaria, they're actually very important for keeping our bats going. Aside from birds, bats, fishes, we also get mammals in salt marsh. We know that sometimes swamp wallabies will make nests in salt marsh, and we know that flying fox will also use salt marsh and mangroves as well, and they often roost in mangroves and feed in the salt marsh. So they're important for a lot of the animals that we have. Now, unfortunately for salt marsh, there really highly desirable areas to build on because they're usually right beside the water. In fact, they are beside the water, and they're also flat. So it's quite an easy process if you're a developer to simply fill it all in and put houses on there or factories and things like that. And so because of that reason in particular, we've lost most of the salt marshes in New South Wales, particularly Sydney, where we could have lost as much as 97% of the salt marsh that was once here. So this is one of the few good salt marsh habitats that we have in the Sydney area. We've got another really good salt marsh at Tower Point. We've got some salt marsh up in the Hawkesbury River system, up say Mangrove Creek and Mooney and Mullet Creek and those places. But as far as the real urban environment, this is one of the few existing habitats of salt marsh that are still in relatively good nick. So development is a big problem, but there's lots of other pressures on salt marsh. We have climate change is believing to be impacting on salt marsh, because with climate change and associated sea level rise, we find that mangroves might be moving in to salt marsh habitat, and we also find that the salt marsh habitat won't have anywhere to go, so to speak. So what I mean by that is that if salt marsh is going to move up along the tide, the shoreline, it needs to find flat areas to go, and it needs to be able to occupy those areas. But in an urban environment, you find that usually there's houses there, or there's other built structures that stop the salt marsh from going anywhere. So as sea level rises and the mangroves move in on the salt marshes will be ever decreasing. Some of the other problems that we face with salt marshes is that they're really popular with four-wheel drive enthusiasts and trail bike riders, again because they're flat and because you can imagine it'd be quite easy to go ploughing through here in a big four-wheel drive, and it is, and so they've done a lot of damage to some of the salt marshes around New South Wales. And also people often just drive in there any old car, and then when it fails to go anymore, they just dump it. So dumped cars are also a big problem in salt marshes as well, and for many reasons, not the least because they're ugly and unsightly, but also because they've often still got fuels and oils and things that contaminate the soil. Other problems are again associated with hydrology or the water. For example, you have stormwater runoff entering salt marshes, and that can create scour, but it also reduces the salinity of the soil and carries with it the seeds of weeds and things like that. More species of plants that wouldn't normally come into a salt marsh because it's so salty, but with the changed salinity regime from the fresh water coming in, they now spread into the salt marsh, and so you can lose a lot of salt marsh simply from having a stormwater pipe just draining into it. Similarly, you've got boat wash will wash up and erode large areas of shore.